On March 2, 2026, somewhere in Germany, a factory manager sat at his desk and opened an email from his energy supplier. The price of his gas contract had just jumped. Surprised, he didn't know anything about Iranian drones. He didn't know about a place called Ras Laffan. He knew one thing: his production costs had just changed overnight, and nobody had warned him it was possible. Size. That factory manager is the story I want to tell you today. Not the geopolitics, not the missiles. The chain of decisions that made ordinary people in Germany, in Italy, in France, hostages to a conflict they had no part in. Because here's what I've studied in this crisis, and what I found was uncomfortable. This wasn't a surprise. Not to the analysts, not to the think tanks, not to anyone who bothered to look at the structure of global energy supply. The surprise was that everyone kept acting as if the structure didn't matter. Let me show you what I mean. Qatar is a peninsula the size of Connecticut. It has no rivers, almost no agriculture, about 3 million people, most of them foreign workers. What it has, buried under its seabed and shared with Iran, is the North Field, the largest single natural gas reservoir on the planet. That one geological accident turned a desert emirate into the world's third largest exporter of liquefied natural gas, responsible for roughly 1/5 of everything the global market moves in any given year. Think about that number. One country, one facility, one choke point, 20%. Thoughtful. For comparison, imagine if one farm sitting in one valley in one country grew 20% of the world's wheat. You would consider that a systemic risk. You would call it fragile. You would build redundancy into the supply chain before anything went wrong. Concerned? Energy analysts had been calling Qatar's Ras Laffan complex exactly that, a single point of catastrophic failure, for years. The International Energy Agency had documented it. Researchers at Chatham House had written about it. The data from KPLR, the commodity intelligence firm, showed year after year that traffic through the Strait of Hormuz carried roughly 20% of global oil supply and 38% of seaborne crude oil trade, with Qatari LNG running through the same narrow passage. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. Iran sits on one side. The entire energy architecture of the Persian Gulf hangs on that 21 miles. On March 2nd, Iranian drones struck 2 facilities inside Qatar's Ras Laffan industrial city. One hit a water tank at a power plant in Mesaieed. The other struck directly at the LNG processing infrastructure. Surprised, Qatar Energy, the world's largest LNG producer, announced a complete shutdown of production the same day. The next day, they suspended downstream production as well: polymers, methanol, aluminum, associated products. Then they declared force majeure, the legal mechanism that allows a company to skip contracted deliveries without financial penalty. Size, force majeure. In plain language, we cannot deliver, and the courts will understand why. Within hours, the Dutch TTF contract, the benchmark price Europeans use to measure the cost of their gas, surged nearly 50%. Bloomberg reported it hit levels not seen since 2023. The British gas contract jumped 43 pence per therm in a single session. Asian LNG benchmark prices climbed almost 40% simultaneously. And here is where the story gets interesting. Not the spike was predictable. Curious. What's interesting is who the real winners were, and they were not the ones making headlines. While European headlines focused on the pain, factories slowing down, energy ministers convening emergency meetings, EU gas coordination groups scrambling, the market was quietly doing what markets do. It was redistributing the shock, and it was not redistributing it equally. The United States, already the world's largest LNG exporter, was sitting in an extraordinary position. American export facilities, according to multiple reports, had been running at utilization rates between 120 and 137% in early 2026. Every molecule of American LNG that wasn't already committed under long-term contracts was suddenly worth more, significantly more, on the global spot market. Curious American LNG producers didn't create this crisis, but they were structurally positioned to benefit from it in ways that no European government, no Asian importer, and certainly no Qatari official had any control over. That is the zero-sum game nobody wanted to say out loud. Size Qatar's loss was, in direct financial terms, someone else's gain. Now let me walk you through the chain of decisions that built this fragility. Because this didn't happen in a week. This was assembled over 2 decades. After the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine, Europe made a rapid and necessary pivot. Russian pipeline gas, which had supplied roughly 40% of European natural gas needs at its peak, had to go. The alternatives were Norway, Algeria, LNG from the United States, and LNG from the Persian Gulf, primarily Qatar. The pivot was real. LNG became the backbone of European supply security. By 2025, LNG accounted for approximately 50% of all European gas imports. Here is the problem. Europe didn't diversify away from dependency. Europe traded one dependency for several smaller ones. Norway has capacity limits. Algeria has political risk. The United States was welcome, but already near full utilization. And Qatar, comfortable, professional, contractually reliable Qatar, became an increasingly important structural piece in the European energy mosaic. Size. According to data from Supplier, Europe imported approximately 9.2 million tons from Qatar in 2025 alone. Italy held a long-term supply agreement with Qatar approaching 5 million tons annually. Qatari entities held significant regasification terminal capacity in the United Kingdom, including major positions at South Hook and the Isle of Grain, and additional capacity at Montoire in France. Concerned. This is what institutional dependency looks like at ground level, not just contracts, infrastructure. The physical systems through which energy flows were designed and partly owned with Qatar in the loop. When Qatar stopped producing, the hole wasn't just in the volume numbers, it was in the plumbing. And there is a timing dimension that makes this particularly sharp. European gas storage as of March 2026 sat at approximately 30% capacity, the lowest level since 2022. Concerned, the winter heating season was ending, which meant the pipeline for refilling storage for the coming winter was about to open. In a normal year, Europe buys aggressively on the spot market during spring and summer to rebuild reserves. In the spring of 2026, it was entering that buying season in a market that had just lost 20% of its global supply, and it was competing against Asia. Size. Wood Mackenzie's vice president of gas research described it precisely. Disruptions to LNG flows would reignite competition between Asia and Europe for available cargoes. That competition is not neutral. Asia's immediate vulnerability was acute. Pakistan sourced 99% of its LNG from Qatar and the UAE. Bangladesh sourced 63% from the same region. India moved to emergency protocols for its fertilizer sector. These countries don't have the fiscal power to outbid European industrials on the spot market. But Japan, South Korea, and China, which collectively account for more than half of global LNG imports, do, and they were buying. Europe was caught in a bidding war with the world's largest economies for a commodity that, according to Morgan Stanley, had just seen its projected 2026 surplus effectively erased in a single week. The bank had forecast a surplus of up to 6 million tons for the year. The Qatari disruption wiped that buffer off the table. Size. The structural damage report, released publicly by Qatar Energy CEO Saad Al-Kaabi, detailed exactly what had been lost. 2 of Qatar's 14 LNG trains, the massive industrial systems that cool natural gas to minus 260 degrees Fahrenheit to turn it into a transportable liquid, had been directly damaged in the strikes. One of Qatar's 2 gas-to-liquids facilities was also compromised. The repair timeline, 3 to 5 years. Annual capacity sidelined, 12.8 million tons. Estimated construction cost of the damaged units, 26 billion dollars. Al-Kabi told Reuters the scale of damage had set the region back, in his assessment, 10 to 20 years. Pause. Let that land. Not 10 to 20 weeks, not 10 to 20 months, 10 to 20 years. Serious. Now I want to show you the dilemma that sits at the center of this story, because every major actor is facing it and none of the options are clean. For Europe, the immediate choice is between pain now and structural reform later, or managed pain now paired with actual diversification investment. The first path is politically easier. Thoughtful, emergency measures, demand reduction protocols, some strategic reserve releases, some coal reactivation, and hope the conflict de-escalates. It's the same playbook from 2022, and it works for a season. The deeper question is whether Europe will use this second disruption to build the infrastructure redundancy it didn't build after the first. Size. For the United States, the position is simultaneously an opportunity and a credibility test. American LNG is being called on to fill the gap. But American facilities were already running at maximum utilization before the crisis. Ramping production requires terminal capacity that takes years to permit and build. Washington can offer political reassurance. It can accelerate approvals. It cannot conjure liquefaction capacity that doesn't exist yet. For Qatar, the calculation is different. Al-Kabi said it clearly. For production to restart, hostilities must cease. Qatar does not control that variable. What it does control is the narrative of its own indispensability, and how it uses that leverage in the reconstruction phase to negotiate the long-term contracts that will finance the rebuilt capacity. And the hidden actor in this story, Iran. The strikes on Ras Laffan were retaliatory, aimed at pressure points in a broader regional conflict, but Iran shares the North Field reservoir with Qatar. The South Pars Field, Iran's portion